All right, 5 Books of Moses, Part 2. This is our 5th session. We're going into the Book of Deuteronomy, the introduction, and quite a few other things. All righty? So, moving into Deuteronomy, what we were supposed to have read was chapters 1 through 4, and the textbook Deuteronomy, the Gospel of Love, which is chapter 1. And I did want to read the preface, which is on pages 7 through 9. I'll read it quickly, but this is really, really important. Does the Pentateuch suggest to you primarily the idea of the law? Do you think of Moses as the lawgiver in contrast to Jesus as the one offering love and grace? Is the God of the Old Testament a God of war, judgment, and wrath, and the God whom Jesus revealed, the Father of mercy and the God of love? If so, the following pages offer you some thought-provoking considerations. The book of Deuteronomy is the most important book in the Old Testament from the standpoint of God's revelation to man. For years in his teaching of the Old Testament survey, the author made it only brief references to Deuteronomy as a book which merely reviews or repeats what precedes in the Pentateuch. Such, however, is not the case. It is one of the books most frequently cited and referred to in the New Testament. Deuteronomy is. Nearly 200 times according to the Greek New Testament and edited by Alan Blackmer, whoever. Deuteronomy presents the core of what God revealed to Moses on Mount Horeb. From the knowledge of his own experience and the failures of one generation of Israelites who had literally been redeemed from Egyptian bondage, Moses here summarizes with a life and death perspective for the new generation. Remember, we're talking still to the new generation. That which is significant and crucial to their welfare. So he's basically saying, hey, you're the new guys, but you need to know all this stuff. The word love is at the heart of the message. Neither a list of do's and don'ts, nor law, nor legalism, nor rules, nor living, nor good works, nor even a high moral standard was primarily in focus. It was love. Basic to all of these was a vital relationship with God, which is the purpose of being here on a Monday night. Till 10:30, some of us. That's the purpose. A vital relationship with God. Not just to read Deuteronomy, not just to read a textbook, not to just do a test that we're going to do in a little while. Not in my class, but in the next class. That's not the purpose. The purpose is a vital relationship with God, a relationship of love. Out of this love relationship issued all other considerations that were important to man. I'm skipping down. As a recipient of God's love, which was evident in his redemption and constant care, the Israelite was expected to respond with wholehearted love and devotion. So as a recipient of God's love, the Israelites' response was supposed to be wholehearted love and devotion, which is also equated to us. Our response to God's love is wholehearted love and devotion. Next paragraph at the top. Out of this unique relationship with his God, the Israelite was to express his love horizontally with his neighbor. So it was vertically with God and horizontally with his neighbor. This vertical and horizontal love relationship, skipping down another paragraph, that Jesus pinpointed at the essence of all that God required of man to obtain eternal salvation. So Jesus requotes this love relationship vertically and horizontally when he says, hey, these are the two most important things you got to do. This is what the entire law and the prophets hang on. These two things. Love your God and love your neighbor. It was in the book of Deuteronomy that Jesus and the religious leaders found the core of God's revelation to man in written form. So they were reading the book of Deuteronomy. Jesus was reading the book of Deuteronomy. Jesus also pointed out that this represented the essence of all that is written in the law and prophets. We just talked about that. Consequently, we do well to study this book, which provides us insight and understanding of the context in which the divine concept of love was revealed through and stated by Moses. That's your preface. And it makes Deuteronomy stand out the way it should. Now, tonight's class will be, since it's the introduction, we're not going, chapter by chapter at this point. So it's going to be a little tedious, and it's going to be an overview, and it's going to be an introduction, and I think we can do it quickly. There'll be some test questions later in the future from this area, and I won't know exactly how just yet. Probably be from your fill-ins, excuse me. But there's a few things we need to know about Deuteronomy before we get in depth and start really learning some things about it. So this won't be as much reflection unless the Holy Spirit speaks, and He might. But this will be more about Deuteronomy, an introduction. Okay? So let's start with, what do we have? Awesome. Perfect. The name. In Jewish tradition, the name of the book of Deuteronomy comes from the first two words of the Hebrew text. Ele Hadebarim, meaning these are the words, or simply Debarim, meaning the words. So that's what Deuteronomy means, the name of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 1:1, these are the words which Moses spoke to all Israel on this side of the Jordan in the wilderness. So they still haven't entered in, and he's speaking these words. The name Deuteronomy comes from the Septuagint translation of a clause in Deuteronomy 17:18, which refers to repetition of this Torah, which is Deuteronomium in Greek. I don't know how to say that word. Deuteronomium. There it is. Deuteronomium in Greek. Repetition of this Torah. The Hebrew actually instructs the king to make a copy of this Torah. The English title for Deuteronomy is based on the Greek mistranslation of a phrase, a copy of this law, as this second law. So the English translation, the English title Deuteronomy, is from a mistranslation, a copy of this law, or the second law. Now let's go into some observations. The next slide about Deuteronomy. Within its present canonical context, the canon is the 66 books we have today. Deuteronomy is in fact a repetition of the Torah of Moses as delivered at Mount Sinai or Horeb. That Mount Sinai and Mount Horeb are the same thing. In the book of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. So it is a repetition of the Torah. However, it should not be neglected for serious study by its alluding to this repetition, quote unquote. Just because it's a repetition doesn't mean we should not study it. Because more than copy of or repetition of, these are the words is a better representation of what the book of Deuteronomy is. Moses combines his farewell address and the renewal of God's covenant. That's in your notes. Of God's covenant with the Israelites in written form. So he wrote out the renewal of the covenant in this book of Deuteronomy. And he's speaking to the new generation. The old generation had it already written out on tablets of stone that were thrown into they end up in the Ark of the Covenant, but they were not. This is Deuteronomy now. This is the new generation. This is saying, hey, here they are. You guys need to know what this is all over again. That's why I'm repeating it. These are the words. All right? Deuteronomy is also a literary bridge connecting the first two major sections of the canon of the Hebrew Bible, the Torah and the prophets. So Deuteronomy forms a bridge from the beginning, the Torah, to the prophets, which is what we're studying in the next class. Particularly true in regards to the close connection with the book of Joshua. Deuteronomy has a close connection with Joshua. Deuteronomy is a summary of the divine revelation given during Moses' leadership. Next slide. Deuteronomy emphasizes what is important for the Israelites in their relationship with God. Remember that word, relationships. It's about a relationship of love with God. We can't get stuck on just instructions. As opposed to their religious responsibilities spelled out in previous books of the Pentateuch, which we know, right? Leviticus, Exodus, Numbers, all these religious responsibilities, what each tribe is going to do, remember? Okay? That's not what Deuteronomy is about. Deuteronomy is about the relationship with God. Authorship. Next slide. Who wrote it? Let's see where we're at. There are basically two viewpoints to who wrote Deuteronomy. And you've already heard previously in this class, and you know which one we think when you'll see these two. But the first viewpoint is that there is a late composition. There's a late composition. The details of this, you would have read it in chapter 1 of the textbook. There's a late composition. Some scholars say this book was written during the 7th century BC. That would be between 600 and 700 BC. In this theory, Moses had nothing to do with what was reported in Deuteronomy, nor did he have any part in the literary composition of the book. That's the late composition. Moses didn't have anything to do with it. We, however, believe, and we'll show why, that Moses as author. Moses is the author. So it's Moses as author. There's late composition and Moses as author. Many others, the minority is the late composition. Many others recognize Moses as the author, thus placing it much earlier. This is the older Christian and Jewish tradition that Deuteronomy offers an accurate record of Moses' address to the Israelites on the plains of Moab. If you remember from the maps where Moab was. For example, scribes writing for him. The account of his death had to be written by scribes. Okay? So there probably were some scribes writing for Moses. But Moses is essentially responsible for this writing along with the rest of the Pentateuch. C. Internal claims indicate that speeches were delivered orally in the last month of the 40-year period of Moses' leadership. These are all the reasons that we believe Moses is the author. It's an older Christian tradition. Many recognize Moses as the author. Internal claims indicate that these speeches were delivered orally. D, I think most importantly, Jesus in his teaching, I may have D and ones and things differently in there. We are still under Moses as author. Yeah, some of the things I'm explaining are not in your notes. Right now I'm explaining why. Yeah, your next notes should be at D that you're writing in. Brief outline. Okay, forget D's, 1s, 2s, and 3s. Okay. Here we go. Authorship, right? Background. We haven't gotten to background yet. That's over here. So I'm still talking about authorship. It's just that all of this is not necessarily in your notes. Okay? I'm telling you the 4 or 5 reasons. As a matter of fact, I have it highlighted here what is in your notes. So I'll tell you this is in your notes, okay, to make it easier. We're still on Moses as author under authorship. Okay, and these are some of the reasons. If you want to take some of these scripture references down from up top, if you want to write a couple notes about it, obviously they will not be on your test. You can write about them in your paper because we're referring to them in class if it has anything to do with it. But I wasn't going to make your notes 17 pages long like this is. Okay? So, this is an important part. Jesus in his teaching and the apostles pointed to Moses as the author of Deuteronomy, as well as the Pentateuch. So to me, that's one of the most compelling reasons. And that's found in these scripture verses that you see up top. Matthew 19:8, John 5:46 and 47, 7 and 19, Acts chapter 3 and 22, and Romans 10:5. You don't have to know all those. That's just telling you 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 5 different places that Jesus and the apostles are saying Moses wrote this thing. Takes out that late composition theory, in my opinion. And then from your textbook, it was because for those who regarded the Bible as trustworthy and a reliable book, it is difficult to disassociate Moses in the historical sense from personal involvement in the events as well as writing Deuteronomy. So those are the reasons that we believe Moses was the author. I believe that. Okay, background. Background, which is the next slide. There's nothing for you to fill out in this, okay? The background to the book of Deuteronomy. First in Genesis, there are divine promises to the patriarchs that happen in Genesis. Deliverance from Egypt happened in Exodus, the Ten Commandments. The priestly code, the laws and the covenant happened in Leviticus. Failures and wilderness wanderings, which we just studied, happen in Numbers. And now, prospect of a new generation entering the promised land and the Ten Commandments again in Deuteronomy. Okay? And we'll go over where the Ten Commandments were in two different books of the Bible. Now we're in brief outline. Next slide. A brief outline of Deuteronomy. And this is from your textbook. Okay? I'm not sure what page it was, I can tell you. 17. It does say 17? Okay, good. I put that in yours and not in mine. Thank you. This is a brief outline of Deuteronomy. Chapters 1 through 4 deal with lessons from history. So he's talking to the new generation, and he's saying, here's what we have to learn from what happened. It's been 40 years. Not only that, we got to go back and review Egypt, Exodus, how we got out, what God did. Excuse me. We got to talk about history. Lessons from history in chapter 1 through 4. Number 2, the love relationship. The love relationship. That's chapters 5 through 11. This is how the book breaks down, according to your book. The love relationship, which is what we want to focus on in Deuteronomy. The love relationship. Chapters 12 through 26, the God-related life. Chapters 27 through 20. I don't know why that's like that. It's probably 20 through 27. No, 30. That's what it is. I put that wrong. Is it right in yours? Or is it wrong in yours? Okay, put a 3. It's 30. That's a typo. The alternatives for Israel, 27 through 30. And 31 through 34, very important, and we'll talk about this little area a little bit later, is the community of covenant. Continuity, excuse me. Continuity, I took off my glasses, wishful thinking. Continuity of covenant. And this is in 16 pica, so I should be able to do it. Continuity of the covenant, 31 through 34. Meaning, God has not left. God has not stopped entrusting us. God has not taken his hand from us. God is going to walk us in, reminding the new generation that what happened to them will not happen to you. Why? Because we're going to be obedient. We're going to remember the law. We're going to remember history. We're going to do what we have to do. We're going to form a relationship with God. It's not all about rules anymore. Let's just love him. We're going to walk into this land. He's going to give it to us, etc., etc., etc. And all of a sudden, that covenant is continued. Remember, a covenant always has two sides. The faithful side of it is because God is faithful. But we're supposed to be faithful too. A covenant is when you cut covenant with somebody, you're supposed to do something and I'm supposed to do something. I'm married to my wife, so I love her and she loves me. Now that doesn't mean when she stops loving me, I stop loving her. That's what God does with us. But a covenant is still in two directions. Okay? So he's reminding the children of Israel of that. Now, the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy. Next slide. This is the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy. It's also in Exodus, and I'll show you that in a minute. The Ten Commandments, they have been argued to be at the center of the canonical process, meaning where we get our word from, where all Scripture comes from. The center is right here in Deuteronomy. And even biblical theology. There's people that believe, and this is according to S. Herman. I don't know his first name. But I like what he wrote. And that's basically saying all of biblical theology, everything that we study, everything that we know about God, the center of it all is right here in Deuteronomy. And it would make sense because Jesus and the apostles and the New Testament, this is the book that is most quoted in the New Testament. So it's a great theory or process of thought to think Deuteronomy is really the center of who God is, or God is trying to show us who he is. So that's what we want to find in Deuteronomy in this class. We want to find, why is this book so important? Why is Deuteronomy at the center? Or even the next one here. your next one down, also the canonical process begins with the Ten Commandments. All right? Canon, the word canon means in its simplest form. So the canonical process is not only how we get our Bible, but if you took the word literally, in its simplest form, Deuteronomy is the center of biblical theology in its simplest form. Love your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as you love yourself. In its simplest form, it basically outlines the Bible and what we're to do. Also, the canonical process begins with the Ten Commandments. That's also in your notes, but I think it's already written in. So, the Ten Commandments, in this begins idea, it begins with the Ten Commandments, are used to shape the content of the laws of Deuteronomy 12:26, which is the Deuteronomic Code. We've talked about that in other classes. We're not going to stop there. And the Ten Commandments touch on virtually every aspect of a person's life in ancient Israel on both community and individual level. Okay, you can see how this thing can be the center or the beginning of biblical theology. So here's the order of the commandments. It's the next slide. You can put it up. There you go. The introduction is chapters 11, 26 through 32. The Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy, which is the first two commandments in Deuteronomy, which is no other gods but Yahweh, that's in 12 and 13, right? 12:1, you can see it there. I don't have to get too detailed with this. Taking God's name in vain, the third one, it's in 14, chapter 14. Keeping the Sabbath holy, 14 through 16. That's a bunch of chapters just to talk about keeping the Sabbath holy. Parental respect, 16 through 18. Homicide. I kind of like how it wrote homicide. Does anybody ever wonder about kill and murder? You ever bring that into your mind? Because I always had not always, but that's an issue that I've always thought of is God very, very soon is commanding Israel to go to war with these people and kill them all. I mean, children and everything, kill them. Wait a second, doesn't that violate commandment number 6? Thou shalt not kill, or thou shalt not commit murder. Which is it? And I think there's a difference. Well, let's say it like this. There is a difference between murder and killing. I'm not trying to go theological. I'm just saying this is a good thing to study. Because is God inconsistent with his law? Would God send his own people to violate one of his commandments? So that's why I think there's a difference between kill and murder. Murder is there's absolutely no reason for you to go and do something like this. Kill is what our people are doing in Afghanistan when somebody's got them in their sights. And if they don't pull the trigger, they're dead. And that's how I see it. Again, this is not biblical theology. God has to make sense. God has to coincide with his word. So that's why I think there's differences. And that's just something you can study. I just thought that's something interesting. Adultery, 21 through 24. Chapters 21 through 24. Theft and false testimony and coveting, 24 to 25. And the appendum, 25. Chapter 25. The Ten Commandments are found in, this would be good to know, if they're the center of our biblical theology, it would be good to know where you find them. Yes? Okay. These are fill-ins, and then I'll go to your question. Exodus, chapter 20, verses 2 through 17. And then, obviously, Deuteronomy, chapter 5, verses 6 through 21. That's where the commandments are. Tony. Capital punishment, I believe it's a law. Me personally, I believe it's a law of the land, and God has placed authority on this earth to make laws, and that is a law of the land that we follow. This would honestly be a discussion that can go on for the next 30 minutes. So I'm giving you what I believe. Is it killing or is it murder? that's a moral subject that truly can be debated for hours and hours and hours. I personally believe in capital punishment because it is a law. It's almost like, why are you taking money out of my pocket? I was just speeding. Well, you disobeyed the law, and there's a price to pay for that law. Those laws were made by governmental authorities that are all under God, in a sense. You have to go find it scripturally. So I don't know if you disagree or agree with capital punishment. I personally think that if that's the law, then that's the payment for the crime. I don't see it as a murder-kill thing. I see it as a payment for a crime. And it's a law that's could easily be read. The person who went and did that, they knew they shouldn't have. And it's just like you don't get killed for speeding. Yeah, well, it's not really, well, kind of, sort of. But sin is sin, just like we talked about this weekend. Jeffrey Dahmer, if he truly accepted Christ at the very end of his life, he's in heaven. That makes some people sick. You tell that to the people the parents and the children and the cousins and the uncles of the people he killed. He's in heaven. You're going to see him in heaven today. They'll punch you in the face. More than likely, unless they have a really amazing understanding of God and forgiveness. Because that doesn't make sense to me that he can go through his whole life physically, mentally, in my flesh. It doesn't make sense to me that someone can go through their whole life killing, murdering for no reason, and then at the end of their life say, oh, I realize God is God. Praise God, I'm going to heaven. It doesn't make sense. But then again, does it make sense that the thief on the cross, one went to damnation and one went to heaven with Jesus? Because of their attitudes at the very end of their life? Because of what they said and what they proclaimed? So this is where I get to the place where understanding, I stop my understanding somewhere. I got to say, okay, I don't understand it all. And that's just what I do with it. I couldn't theologically defend that forever. That is just my belief. And a study on that would be a great thing to do. Susie?
Even when you start this line of conversation, it makes me think that that's a really good thing to kind of ponder, because even in the quote that they put, it was like he had an understanding that he's going to have to stand before God and be judged for what he did.
Oh, yeah.
And the Bible tells us that there's going to be judgment for everything that we do.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to have to answer to God for everything that we do.
Yeah.
So even though he gets to heaven, it's kind of like, okay, so what's going to happen?
Sure.
Because, yes, he's saved, but then
Mm-hmm.
he paid for what he did.
Right.
So it's like, it's another.
And that judgment and that price was completely paid for by Jesus. Throw another monkey wrench in the thing. Okay? It's like, wait, but he deserved. Ooh, really? Then what do we deserve? So it's a great debate. I would love to do it, but if not, you guys, if we do that, we can't study for the test next thing. No, honestly, I love debates like that. And that's a great thing to always be thinking, because you will be asked these questions. And you need to be able to defend your faith to whatever level you can. But then at some point, you got to understand, you need to be able to defend your faith. Part of defending your faith is realizing that it's faith. And Dr. Sharp said it great. I can't prove which one's right. I can't tell you if it's creation or evolution with a test tube and a microscope. I can't tell you. The scientist said it. Choose the one you want to believe. You can believe evolution or you can believe creation, because there's no one there. Nobody was there. So, cool. Thanks for the question. That was good. Other than forgetting where I was. Okay, here we are. Exodus chapter 20, verse 2 through 17, and Deuteronomy 5, 6 through 21. That's where the commandments were. I would advise that you know that. Okay, now, this is where Logos teaches this musical composition and numerical composition of Deuteronomy. And, honestly, it is really interesting. I never had a full or even a half grasp about this. I just started reading through this and realizing it. And I'm teaching it through Logos information, which is kind of what we're teaching all of it with. But I can't say I was an expert in any sense of the musical composition of Deuteronomy or the numerical composition of Deuteronomy. It is just very interesting, and I'm going to present some points hopefully in the next 15 minutes, and then we'll be out. And then next week we'll start into Deuteronomy, chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We'll get into the book. Right now it's still overview, facts about Deuteronomy, observations about Deuteronomy, so that's where we're at. The musical composition of Deuteronomy. That's slide number 12. Awesome. The book we call Deuteronomy was in the hands of the Levites. These are some of the reasons why they believe there's a musical composition, which is Deuteronomy 17, verse 18. Now, the Levites were commanded by Moses to recite it at the Feast of Booths. Deuteronomy 31, verse 9. And here we go. It is likely that it was sung, and that this greater song of Moses, which is the entire book of Deuteronomy. It's another name for the book of Deuteronomy, which we'll talk about in a second. Song of Moses, the entire book, was taught to the people. Now, it starts to make sense if you think about how easy you learn a song, how much faster you learn lyrics because they're in a melody or they have some sort of music, to just having to recite something. Somebody was with the conversation today about the national anthem, because we're talking about Christina Aguilera, poor thing. She was over the ramparts. And we were talking about the national anthem, and if you went to a school, it was Melanie Gomez and Maury, and I forgot who else was in the kitchen. I don't know if it was John or somebody else was in the kitchen. And we talked about how maybe she did not, being such a young star, or starlet, maybe she didn't go to school where you sang the national anthem every single day. In public school, when I went to public school back in the 40s, nobody caught that? Actually, it was in the 70s. When I went to public school in the 70s, okay, we sung the national anthem every day, and we pledged allegiance every day. And then we had a moment of silence for prayer, and you could pray whatever you wanted. Not out loud, a moment of silence to respect everybody. Everybody could pray. Well, so they were bringing up how she may have not grown up singing the national anthem every day because she might have been homeschooled, traveling. She was Mickey Mouse Club and all these things as a young girl. And she came into the scene I think at 15, 16. Very, very young. So I thought that was really interesting because she was saying if she would have she would have been singing the national anthem every day for 6 or 8 years of her childhood, maybe she would not have forgotten the words because they would have been reflexive. And this is where this comes into play. Is Deuteronomy, learning the entire book of Deuteronomy, where God is telling him, commanded Moses to recite it at the Feast of Booths in Deuteronomy 31:9. It's likely that it was sung because it's that much easier to memorize. So, another point is that it was recited in Levitical circles as a primary means of religious education. Also, another point defending this musical composition of Deuteronomy is that it was eventually put in written form and promulgated in Jerusalem as part of a reform movement in the days of King Josiah, as he discovered important Jewish scriptures during the so-called Deuteronomic reform. So King Josiah reigned as king of Judah. He was the king of Judah, right, where we get praise. King of Judah from 641 to 609 BC. He is named, King Josiah is named in the genealogy of Jesus in the book of Matthew. So they're saying that because he discovered all these ancient scriptures, they were then put into written form from a musical form. The canonical text was recited within the musical tradition of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. That's also what researchers have found and people believe. Also, the practice of canting or singing the weekly portions of the readings from the Pentateuch is still present in some Jewish synagogues today. So still today, you go into a Jewish synagogue and they're canting or singing readings of the Pentateuch. That is not only a Jewish thing, being brought up in the Catholic faith for 20 years of my life. A lot of times the priests were singing in a very monotone, melodramatic type of voice, but I can still hear that today, exactly what they were saying, exactly what they're singing, and I can still hear it. Okay? I still remember some of the songs that we used to sing I must have been 12 years old, and I could still remember some of those songs. So, it should also be noted that music and poetry are a common medium for transmitting cultural tradition among virtually all so-called pre-literate people. Before people were reading and writing, music and poetry are common mediums. Still in tribes today, they pass things along through poetry and music, storytelling, singing songs. So, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, there's still tribes in sub-Saharan Africa that are translating to written form. And this happened, basically this guy, Herbert Clem, reports that the Word of God brought to peoples through their own mediums of music is showing a much more promise and infiltration of their culture than leaving them with books in their language. So these missionaries are going all out to translate Bibles into the language of pre-literate people. So great, they have the Bible in their dialect and in their language that they only speak. They don't write it. So if they don't write it, they don't read it. So what this particular gentleman, Herbert Clem, is reporting that if we do it in song, we're infiltrating the culture. They're starting to remember the Word of God because we're starting to do it in song. Because they don't write. They don't read. But it passes along in song.
So is it safe to assume that when before they started transcribing everything, like the oral tradition, they would sing out like the Gospels?
That's what this musical composition of Deuteronomy, they're basically establishing as a fact. This is basic. Logos and the people who put this study together are saying this thing is musical. And it's called the Song of Moses. So, yes, it's safe to assume that. Because what other way? It could have been just reciting, but it makes sense that it would be sung. All right? In short, Deuteronomy, and this is in your notes, in short, Deuteronomy is best explained as a didactic poem composed to be recited publicly to music in ancient Israel with a liturgical setting. So it's best explained as a didactic poem composed to be recited publicly to music. So it's like a poem. It's a song. Songs rhyme for the most part. Okay? Why? It was in order to transmit a canonical body of tradition as effectively as possible to a given people. And it was composed in epic style to be compared with such classics as Homer's Iliad and Virgil's Aeneid. Recent research, this is more reasons, okay? Recent research suggests that the Hebrew text in its present form, as preserved by the Masoretes, is a musical composition. And in Greek culture, music and poetry were one for a time. They were not separate. Music and poetry were one thing, basically, in Greek culture. The same idea is more than likely what took place in ancient Israel. When you say ancient, we're really talking ancient, okay? This goes back way before Christ. No newspapers, no iPads. Remember, the Bible is not a collection of independent books which certain scribes assembled in a library. It is a single book by a single author, if you believe it is the Word of God. So like a love song or a love poem, that's what the Bible is to God's people. It's like a love song or a love poem, especially Deuteronomy. A love song or a love poem to His people. And His people, by the way, includes us. We are His people. I know you all know that, but it's good to be reminded. Now we go to the numerical composition of Deuteronomy. And this gets a little Bible code-ish, but it is super interesting. Super interesting. And again, this is pretty much new to me. I've studied it from this book, and from that book, and that's about it. All right? Serious academic research of the numerical composition of the Bible has been discredited by works like the Bible Code and several others. Serious study of the numerical composition, meaning obviously numbers, that it's all mathematically put together somehow, has been discredited by the Bible Code and other works. However, these works should not make the subject moot, as studies of numerical composition, structure, and meaning of the Bible text have been fruitful. The first attempt, I don't know if this is something we have to know off the top of our tongues, but this is pretty cool. Just listen for a second and we're pretty much almost done. Oscar Goldberg in 1908, his thesis was that the Pentateuch is a numerical composition governed by the number 7 and the two divine name numbers 17 and 26, which stand for Yahweh. Don't ask me why, because I don't know. But 17 and 26 were the divine name numbers, and 7. Now, Goldberg was ignored in the mainstream of scholarly research for more than half a century until this guy, Klaus Schedel. This guy, Klaus, initiated logotechnique, which is logotechnical analysis, which opened the door for numerical study as a new perspective for traditional literary criticism of biblical text. So, this logo technique is grounded in 3 principles. Okay? Hebrew letters, this is a fact, Hebrew letters have numerical values. That's true. It's called gematria or something like that. Second thing, a close relationship exists between counting and writing. That's just a deduction that anybody can make. And a close relationship exists between biblical text and counting. So he was scorned and ridiculed by his colleagues, but he continued into his uncharted waters and laid the foundation on which Caspar Labouchaine, I guess, would build a significant structure. All right? We haven't gotten to the next slide yet. You have one thing that you're going to fill in here, which is this. As a methodological principle, logotechnical analysis of the Bible is still in its infancy. The Bible Code does not have the explanation. Other books about it don't have the explanation. It's still in its infancy. Maybe you want to take a shot at studying the Bible numerically. You might be the next Klaus Schedel. You might not be shunned as much because, look, the Bible Code sold millions of copies. I may be misquoting, but I know it was hundreds of thousands of copies. The larger work for numerical structure analysis of the Bible remains a task for others to complete in the years to come. And with computers, I'm sure that people are really working on this hard. But here it is. It seems to have its merit. And I'm going to read you from page 28 in this book, because this just struck me. This is very, very interesting. I put 26. It was supposed to be... Yeah, it's 26. Okay. This is this book, not your book. It's not 26 in your book. In the fundamental sense, then, the book of Deuteronomy is, in its entirety, may be described as poetry in the broadest sense. Though it contains a lyric, Song of Moses, in Deuteronomy 32, most of the book is in the form of didactic poetry of a lesser nature, so far as heightened speech goes. The composer of the original was Moses, but the text as we have it enjoyed a life of its own. For generations within the public worship of ancient Israel, like Robinson's hymn, individual songs or words. I'm not sure I'm reading in the right place. I was trying to prove numbers. No, that's not the numerical composition. This is, excuse me. Okay, here it is. Sorry. Surprising conclusions emerge in the grand totals for extended passages in Deuteronomy. particularly in the 11 weekly portions of the lectionary cycle of Deuteronomy, which actually that's what we're going to be doing our class on the readings that they still do in synagogues of the Pentateuch. Labuschagne observes that Deuteronomy 12:1 through 12:1 through chapter 16 and 17 contain a total of 119 verses, which is 7 times 17, which consists of 3 sections that include the various laws corresponding to the first 4 of the 10 commandments. The inner core, which is chapters 12 through 26, opens with the words, "These are the statutes and the judgments which you shall be careful to do in the land." 12:1 concludes with these words. All right? Between these 2 verses, there are exactly 340 verses. 2 times 10 times 17. And then it goes on and on and on. All these, I won't read them all because it take forever. All these are multiples of 17 from chapter 1 through 322, which is 800 words, which is 23 times 43. I mean, it's all a mathematical equation that they're working on. So it has some merit because from beginning to end of Deuteronomy, every single one of these totals from certain passages, not just cutting the word off where they feel like it, certain passages are a multiple of 17 or 26. I could not tell you. I could not tell you what they're studying. I believe it's the Hebrew text because of the numerical value. Yeah. Okay. So we assume it's true. Well, I would personally tell you it's just another way of studying. I think they're pointing to the grandness and greatness of God, is what I believe that they're doing. That it's not only structured. How do you structure a work to fit all these capacities? I think is what they're getting at. Here's a work of 66 books that went through all these generations from 5,000 years before Christ to 2,000 years after Christ, and it's still diggable. You could still understand more and more of it. You could still find more and more of it. More of it is unknown that is known. I think that just points to the grandness of God, and I believe that that's the purpose of that's why they're saying it's in its infancy. It's like studying the ocean floor. We only know the topography, but we don't know what's down there in every area. And I think that that's what they're trying to do with it, is saying, wow, look at how amazing. They didn't give a reason for that, okay? I would assume that it's look at how God can organize things even numerically. When you think that they're words in Hebrew to bless your life, but they're numerically arranged. And then you connect written with numbers, with music, and all that is really connected because music is numbers anyways. Music is mathematics. Music can be broken down mathematically. Because, it just is. Notes and quarter notes, eighth notes, it's all mathematics. So I think that that's the point. Not sure. Okay, let's finish. Reading Deuteronomy. Next slide. It is often outlined as 3 discourses followed by 3 appendices. 3 discourses. Chapters 1, verse 1 through 4, and 43. I'm sorry, I said that wrong, didn't I? No, I said that right. An historical review of God's dealings with Israel from Mount Horeb to Moab. Concluding with an earnest appeal to faithfulness, obedience, and refraining from all forms of idolatry. The next discourse, chapter 4, 44 through chapter 26, verse 19. An hortatory, which is encouraging or exhorting, a hortatory resume of Israel's moral and civil statutory rulings. And chapter 27 through 30, a predictive and threatening section. It begins with a ritual of covenant, blessings and curses, and concludes with Moses' farewell charge to Israel and formal commission to Joshua as successor. Now what we're doing here, don't get too caught up in this. What we're saying here is these are the ways to read Deuteronomy, an overview. These are 3 or 4 ways that you can overview Deuteronomy as 3 discourses and 3 appendices. The appendices I think are important, okay, and you'll write these in and it's good to know these. Deuteronomy 32 is the Song of Moses, which he taught the people. Deuteronomy 33 is the blessing of Moses, where he forecasts the future of the tribes. And Deuteronomy 34 is an account of Moses' death and burial. Okay, so that's one of the ways that Deuteronomy can be read or understood. 3 discourses, all the way through chapter 30, and then 3 appendices. Another way it can be described as a 5-part concentric structure. All right? I don't believe that you're going to be getting into conversations about 5-part concentric structures, but just in case you want to know, part 1, the outer frame, Deuteronomy 1 through 3, is a look backwards. Part 1 again, the great peroration, which is speech, Deuteronomy 1 through 4. The central core. Okay, so you got basically part 1 and part 2 surrounding the central core, which is the covenant stipulations in 1226. Then you have the covenant ceremony and a look forward. So it's a look forward, a great speech, the covenant, a covenant ceremony, and a look forward. And the way he does this is that center thing is the most important thing. Okay, so Deuteronomy 12 through 26 is the core of Deuteronomy. Labuschagne, which was the guy who was researching it numerically, he says a concentric menorah pattern. Again, please don't get overwhelmed with this. This is just information that is in the book, and it's just kind of interesting if you want to look at Deuteronomy in a few different ways. Moses looks backwards, 1 through 3. Prophetic sermon, 1 through 4. A Horeb covenant, 5 through 11. The law code, which is the statutes and stipulations, Deuteronomy 12:26, which is where the law is. Moab covenant, 27 through 29. Concluding prophetic sermon, 27 to 30, and a look forward. And the last one is the weekly portions of lectionary style of readings from Deuteronomy in the Jewish worship. This is how they read it today in the synagogues, in some synagogues. Okay? And that's basically reading 1 through 9. I don't want to go through every single one of them. The only thing I do want to tell you is this is how we're going to look at it. This is how we're going to study Deuteronomy. In readings 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. So we'll be going in that order. It will be chronologically. We're going to read through Deuteronomy chronologically and study it chronologically. So we will be going through that. The Exodus, by the way, is entering instead of exiting. Exodus, well, Exodus is into the promised land. That's just the opposite word of Exodus. All right? The essence of the covenant, we're going to talk about that. Life in the promised land. Some of them will combine. Some of the readings will combine. Sometimes we'll combine 2, sometimes we'll combine 3 of them. But that's how we're going to study it all the way down to chapter 34. Okay, we're basically done.